Now then, how are you doing? I hope you're well. This is one I've been promising myself for a while. After demonstrating a technique for painting the Northern Lights, I received a number of requests from people asking me how they might paint the Milky Way. So, always up for a challenge, what follows are not one, not two, but three different versions of my efforts. Well, I've kept them all in so that you can enjoy the journey with me. Each version has merits of its own. I'll leave it up to you to decide which is your favourite. I think it would be fair to say that there's no shortage of good open source images on Tinterweb to satisfy one's galactic cravings. Well, this is just a sample of some of the open source images that I managed to find quite easily, and it's all impressive stuff. Quite spectacular, in fact. But if I decide I want to recreate the effect in watercolour, where on Earth or in space do I start? Now, let's get one thing straight right from the start. The easiest way to paint stars is always going to be by using white paint, either acrylic or white gouache. I do tend to be a bit of a purist though, so my challenge to myself was how can it be achieved without using any white paint at all? It is possible to scratch out stars, of course, but we're talking about billions of tiny points of light here, and I have a life to get on with. So the obvious solution, as far as I was concerned, was to use masking fluid. I recommend using an old toothbrush, by the way, one that you're happy to destroy and then discard. The spattering didn't go too well. My first mistake was to have too much fluid loaded on the brush and also to hold the brush with the bristles pointing upwards. This gave the fluid the opportunity to drip down onto the base of the brush so that when I hovered it over my work area, I had large blobs dropping onto the paper. It quickly went from bad to worse, and after trying without much luck to remove the dripped masking fluid, I finally gave up and turned the paper over. This time I took the precaution of shaking as much of the excess off the brush as I could. I also made sure I always held the brush with the bristles facing downwards. I was still getting the odd few large blobs, but persevered anyway, flicking the bristles and pointing them at the paper, in the hope that my random spattering might look vaguely star-like. Despite there being a couple of giant stars, I figured I was starting to get the hang of this. Once I'd completed the random spattering of the masking fluid and waited for it to dry, I proceeded to wet the paper in preparation for a wet-in-wet wash. First, I applied lemon yellow in a loose galactic strip, followed almost immediately by alizarin crimson. French ultramarine completed the effect, although I wasn't sure I liked the way things were going. It's a night sky, so the final addition to my wash was a dark, rich mix of French ultramarine, burnt umber and alizarin crimson. In all the best Milky Way photos, there are areas of gaseous cosmic cloud visible. I decided I would try and produce these by dropping some flakes of sea salt onto the wash while it was still damp. Another bad idea. As I started to remove the masking fluid once everything had dried, I realised with crushing disappointment that there were issues with this, almost too numerous to name. The addition of some dark hills went some way towards placing it all into context, but I was still quite unhappy with my effort. The big blobs were a real disappointment. Spattering the masking fluid at the paper while it was flat on the table produced some odd results. Not very star-like at all, more like comets with tails. I quite liked the colours, but the area of brightness was just too broad and, frankly, stripy. I needed a cup of tea and a rethink. Milky Way Take 2. I needed to give some serious thought to the spattering. Clearly, large drips were potentially ruining my efforts, and the non-circular shapes were just not nearly star-like enough. So, instead of flicking the masking fluid at the paper flat on the table, I opted to flick the paint at the paper attached to the board while it was set at an angle, my normal method of working. This meant that I was able to position the toothbrush so that any large droplets missed the board entirely. I took a slightly different approach to my wet-in-wet wash, reversing the order in which I applied the same three colours. This meant that I started with French ultramarine, added a little alizarin crimson to it, and finished up by applying a hint of lemon yellow to it for extra warmth. By the time I got to the darkest tones, mixed from French ultramarine, burnt umber and alizarin crimson, the wet-in-wet wash felt like it was an improvement. As soon as the wash was dry, I started removing the masking fluid to reveal my stars. Despite being a little on the sparse side, I was reasonably happy with my star field. The huge blobs were gone, and there was a definite galactic feel to its shape. It wasn't until I'd removed all the masking that I realised that I now needed to decide how I was going to create the gaseous cloud effects. Dissatisfied with the earlier sea salt technique, I started scrubbing areas out with the WOOLLEY's Wonder Brush. The minute I started doing this, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Scrubbing at the area of cosmic clouds with a damp brush and dabbing them out with a piece of tissue seemed like a good idea at the time. To be fair, the result didn't seem all that bad if I looked at it through half-closed eyes. Painting in the dark hills also seemed to improve the situation slightly, placing the marks into some sort of context. Well, I managed to retrieve it a little by reshaping the scrubbed out areas with alizarin crimson and softening those areas off with a damp brush. My biggest problem, though, was that I'd already removed the masking, so I found myself desperately trying to paint around the stars. In desperation, I resorted to roughing up the edges of my cosmic clouds with a piece of sandpaper. I was not a happy bunny. Watercolour is a constant learning curve. Despite a few little eureka moments, my experiment hadn't gone at all how I'd expected it to. But then, such is the nature of the beast. I was not going to be beaten. I took much longer over the masking fluid spattering, concentrating the bulk of the drops along the line of the galaxy, which I figured, if I'd learnt anything at all from my previous 2 attempts, needed to be thinner. I reverted back to the colours in my first attempt: lemon yellow, alizarin crimson and French ultramarine, before adding the darkest tones. I liked the hint of warmth, but trying to add it in afterwards, as I had done on the second attempt, simply wasn't practical. I also decided the stars absolutely need to remain masked out for as long as possible. Once the masking is removed, there's simply no putting them back in. I still rather liked the gaseous cloud effects that I'd achieved in the second attempt, but instead of scrubbing them out, I decided to lift them out very lightly with a scrunched up piece of tissue while the sky was still damp and before removing the masking. The amount of lift can be controlled by altering the pressure of the tissue, so I was able to produce some subtle highlights, but then create a few hard edges too, for variation. Finally, I removed the masking fluid and painted in my dark hills, as before. I'm not unhappy with the result. It could still use some finesse, but the general idea is there. My journey into the outer spiral of our galaxy was finally at an end. Time to go lie down in a darkened room and contemplate life, the universe, and everything. In watercolour, things rarely go exactly as planned. Techniques need practicing and refining, and what might at first seem an obvious route into a challenge might not work when used in conjunction with other techniques and tricks. What's important is to try and maintain focus on what it is you're trying to achieve. I had a definite idea about how my Milky Way should look. But when I started out, the techniques I was using were in danger of dictating the outcome more than my original vision, if that makes sense. Well, I hope that's inspired you to go and experiment for yourself and hopefully given you some ideas. Until next time, take care.